When a chemical tanker exploded outside Belmont, Louisiana, 20 adults arrived at Cypress Bay Medical dying. Senior doctors were trapped miles away. Junior staff froze. That's when the new nurse, Mariah Vance, did something no one expected. She took control, sealed a collapsed lung, redirected blood supplies across departments, talked a terrified resident through an emergency airway. 20 lives saved in 120 minutes. But when 3 FBI agents arrived asking for her by name, the entire hospital learned the truth. Mariah Vance wasn't just a nurse, and her past was about to catch up with her. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. It was 1:47 p.m. on a Tuesday when Belmont, Louisiana learned what terror felt like. The sound came first. An unnatural crack that split the afternoon open, sharp enough to silence traffic mid-motion. Then came the force. A chemical tanker, heavy with volatile cargo and momentum it could no longer control, ruptured in an instant that rewrote the day for everyone within miles. Steel screamed as it tore itself apart. Pressure turned liquid into violence. The air itself seemed to recoil as fire and chemical vapor surged outward, swallowing the roadway in a boiling cloud of debris, smoke, and shock. Cars had no time to stop. Metal met metal in a chain reaction of helpless physics. Windshields shattered like brittle ice. A pickup spun, lifted, and slammed sideways. Concrete barriers crumbled under stress they were never designed to hold. Somewhere inside the chaos, alarms began to scream. Car alarms, truck alarms, the shrill, overlapping cries of machines responding to disaster faster than people could. Then the screaming started. Drivers stumbled from their vehicles, disoriented, faces streaked with blood and ash. Some ran, some froze, others dropped to their knees, overcome by pain or panic or both. The sky above the highway darkened as smoke climbed upward, thick and chemical sour, burning lungs with every breath. The smell was wrong, sharp, acrid, unmistakably dangerous. People covered their mouths with shirts, hands, anything, not knowing if it helped, only knowing they had to do something. Sirens ignited across the city in uneven waves, distant at first, then multiplying, converging. Emergency calls began to pour in almost immediately, voices colliding with one another in dispatch centers as operators struggled to keep up. Words like explosion, fire, toxic, and people trapped blurred together, repeated so often they lost meaning and became pure urgency. At Cypress Bay Medical Center, the first call hit like a dropped glass, sudden, sharp, attention-grabbing. Then another. And another. Within moments, phones were ringing faster than they could be answered. Radios crackled nonstop, screens filled with red alerts. The controlled hum of a working hospital fractured into something frantic and unstable. A nurse at the front desk stopped mid-sentence as she listened to the dispatcher on the line. Her face drained of color. She didn't hang up right away, just stared, as if the words alone had pinned her in place. When she finally lowered the phone, her voice trembled as she tried to explain what she'd just heard. They're saying dozens, maybe more. That was when the waiting room noticed something was wrong. Staff began moving faster, but not yet with purpose. People spoke over one another. Orders were given, then contradicted, then forgotten. A resident dropped a clipboard and didn't stop to pick it up. Another stood frozen at a computer terminal, staring at the screen without typing, fingers hovering uselessly over the keys. In the emergency department, stretchers were pulled from storage. Supplies were dragged into hallways. Someone asked who was in charge. No one answered. Senior surgeons, the ones everyone expected to take command, were nowhere near the building. Roadblocks had gone up almost immediately around the explosion site, sealing off entire sections of the city. Traffic had collapsed into gridlock. Ambulances were fighting their way through chaos, and private vehicles weren't moving at all. The doctors who normally anchored the hospital in moments like this were trapped in their cars, watching smoke rise in the distance, powerless to reach the place they were needed most. Inside the hospital, the realization set in slowly and then all at once. This was happening without them. Junior doctors looked at one another, searching for reassurance they didn't have the experience to give. Nurses waited for direction that didn't come. Every second stretched, heavy with consequence. The mental math began immediately. How many beds? How much blood? How many hands? How little time? The answers didn't add up. Another call came in, then another. Victims were already en route. Some were being driven by strangers who had pulled them from wreckage. Some were walking wounded, still coming down from shock, not yet aware of how badly they were hurt. Others were far worse. A paramedic's voice cut through the noise over the radio, strained and breathless. "We're overwhelmed out here. You need to prepare for mass casualties." That word, mass, landed hard. Panic crept in not as screaming or running, but as hesitation, as missteps, as the subtle breakdown of coordination that turns a team into a crowd. People knew their jobs individually, but the whole had lost its rhythm. The system everyone trusted to function under pressure was buckling under the weight of too many unknowns. In one trauma bay, a young doctor stared at an empty bed and whispered, "What do we do first?" No one answered him. The truth settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. They were not ready. Not for this. Not without leadership. Not without someone to cut through the noise and decide what mattered most when everything mattered at once. Outside, the city continued to unravel. Inside, the hospital hovered on the edge of paralysis. Then, amid the overlapping voices, the ringing phones, the alarms, and the rising fear, something changed. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It didn't demand attention. It simply spoke. Clear, steady, unshaken. And in that moment of paralysis, one voice cut through the chaos. The voice did not shout. It did not compete with the noise or rise above it by force. It simply entered the space, calm and unmistakably certain, and the effect was immediate. Stop moving patients randomly. Triage comes first. People turned before they realized they were doing it. The woman standing near the nurse's station was not someone most of them knew well. In fact, many of them had barely noticed her until that moment. She wore the same scrubs as everyone else, sleeves rolled neatly, posture straight, eyes already scanning the room as if she had been measuring it long before she spoke. Her tone carried no hesitation, no panic, no apology for taking up authority she had not been formally given. Red tags to trauma bays 1 and 2. Yellow to the east wing. Green stays seated until we call them. The words landed cleanly, organized, precise. And for the first time since the calls had started coming in, the noise inside the emergency department softened. Not because there was less chaos, but because there was suddenly direction. Her name was Mariah Vance. She had been at Cypress Bay Medical Center for exactly 3 weeks. Most people remembered her as quiet. Competent, certainly, but reserved to the point of near invisibility. She arrived on time, left without lingering, and never joined the casual conversations that filled break rooms and hallways. When asked personal questions, she answered politely and briefly, redirecting attention back to work with practiced ease. On her first day, she had shaken hands, learned names, and listened more than she spoke. She absorbed protocols quickly, asked thoughtful questions, and never volunteered unnecessary information about herself. When someone joked about where she was from, she smiled and said, "A little of everywhere," and left it at that. There was something distant about her, not cold, but contained, as if she were always holding part of herself in reserve. Now, standing in the middle of a hospital on the brink of collapse, that reserve was gone. What replaced it was focus. "Blood bank needs an inventory count now," she said, already moving. "I want trauma kits prepped in every bay. If you're waiting for a senior consult, stop waiting. Stabilize and move on." A junior resident hesitated, instinctively bristling at being told what to do by someone he barely knew. We're supposed to save as many as we can," Mariah interrupted, not unkindly. "Hierarchy doesn't matter if people bleed out." She was already walking away by the time he processed the sentence. Her calm was contagious. It didn't erase fear, but it anchored it, giving it somewhere to sit instead of letting it spill everywhere at once. People found themselves listening, not because she demanded it, but because what she said made sense. Because she spoke as if time were a resource she understood deeply, and one she refused to waste. A nurse who had been frozen moments earlier found herself moving again, tagging patients with renewed urgency. A tech followed Mariah's instructions without questioning them, surprised at how natural it felt. Doubt lingered in the room, but it was being slowly, steadily pushed aside by something stronger. Competence. As Mariah crossed the emergency floor, she seemed to see everything at once. She noticed the patient whose breathing was too shallow to wait. the 4-line that had been set incorrectly, the supply cart that needed to be relocated. Her decisions were immediate, decisive, and irreversible once made. There was no second-guessing, no visible anxiety about getting it wrong. Someone finally asked the question hanging in the air. Who put you in charge? Mariah didn't stop walking. No one, she said. But right now, someone has to be. For a brief moment, the staff hesitated again. This time, the hesitation wasn't fear. It was uncertainty. About her, about whether they should trust a nurse so new she still felt like a guest in their system. Then the first ambulance arrived. The doors burst open with urgency that left no room for debate. A patient was rushed in, barely conscious, clothes torn and stained, chest rising unevenly. Mariah was there before anyone else could react. Collapsed lung, she said after a single glance. Give me a needle now. The resident beside her stared. Are you sure? Yes. There was no edge in her voice, only certainty. The resident moved. Others followed. And as they worked, the doubt that had clung to them began to loosen its grip. This wasn't luck. This wasn't guesswork. This was someone who had been here before. Between orders, flashes of memory flickered behind Mariah's eyes. Not images she lingered on, but impressions etched too deeply to ever fully fade. Her first day at the hospital felt suddenly distant, almost unreal. Standing in the orientation room, listening to policies she already knew by heart, signing paperwork, smiling when welcomed, carefully avoiding questions that wandered too close to her past. She had chosen this place because it was quiet, because it was supposed to be normal. Normal had found her anyway. As more patients flooded in, Mariah adjusted on the fly, reshaping the response as conditions changed. When supplies ran low, she rerouted them. When a hallway became overcrowded, she cleared it. When someone faltered, she stepped in without judgment, without drama. People began to look for her instinctively. Mariah, we're out of O-negative. Mariah, Trauma Bay 3 is unstable. Mariah, EMS is bringing in 5 more. Each time, she answered without hesitation. Hope crept back into the room, not as optimism, but as momentum, as the sense that this disaster, while still overwhelming, was no longer unmanageable. The system was breathing again. No one noticed when they stopped questioning her authority. It simply happened. And still, they did not know her. Not really. They didn't know why she never panicked. Why her hands stayed steady no matter how much blood covered them. Why her eyes tracked threats before they fully emerged. They didn't know why she carried herself like someone who had already measured the cost of failure and decided to act anyway. All they knew was that the hospital was no longer frozen. And as Mariah Vance stood at the center of controlled chaos, issuing orders with quiet resolve, no one yet realized the truth waiting just beneath the surface. What they didn't know was that Mariah had done this before, in places she could never talk about. The patient arrived barely breathing, each shallow rise of the chest a question mark hanging in the air. Soot streaked his face. His eyes fluttered, unfocused, fighting for oxygen that wasn't reaching his lungs. The room tightened around him as staff moved in, voices overlapping again, urgency threatening to spill back into panic. Mariah was already there. She didn't wait for a monitor to confirm what her instincts had already decided. One look at the uneven movement of his chest, the subtle collapse on one side, the way his breath whistled instead of flowed, and she knew. Collapsed lung, she said calmly. We don't have time. A resident hesitated, glancing at the empty doorway where a senior surgeon should have been. Shouldn't we? Now, Mariah said, holding out her hand. The tray appeared almost instantly. Her movements were precise, economical, stripped of anything unnecessary. She positioned herself, assessed landmarks, and acted with a confidence that felt startling in someone wearing a name badge still unfamiliar to most of the room. The needle went in cleanly. Air hissed free, sharp and unmistakable, and the patient's chest began to rise more evenly almost immediately. Color returned in slow degrees. Oxygen found its way back where it belonged. The room exhaled. Someone whispered, "Holy." The resident stared at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. Where did you learn that? Mariah didn't look up. She was already securing the placement, already thinking ahead. Doesn't matter, she said. Next patient. There was no triumph in her voice. No pause to acknowledge what she had just done. The save wasn't an event to her. It was a step. One in a long sequence that could not afford interruption. And so it continued. A dock worker came in bleeding heavily, the kind of bleeding that drains strength faster than anyone realizes until it's almost gone. Blood supplies were already stretched thin. Someone muttered that they'd have to wait. Mariah didn't accept that. She rerouted resources on instinct, pulling units from areas she knew could spare them, balancing risk in her head faster than anyone could argue. The transfusion started just in time. The bleeding slowed. The dock worker lived. Another patient arrived with crushed ribs, every breath agony, lungs fighting against broken structure. There wasn't time for perfect solutions. Mariah improvised, stabilizing what needed to be stabilized, buying the body time it desperately needed. It wasn't elegant. It was effective. A terrified resident struggled with an emergency airway, hands shaking, eyes wide with the sudden weight of responsibility. Mariah stepped in close, not taking over, but guiding. "Slow down," she said quietly. "You've got this. Angle here. Breathe. Now go." The tube slid into place. The resident looked at her like she had just pulled him back from the edge of a cliff. Patients kept coming, and somehow they kept surviving. No one announced the count. No one had time. But someone started keeping track anyway, scribbling tallies between tasks, unable to ignore the pattern forming in real time. 5 lives stabilized, then 10, then more. The hospital had been drowning. Now it was swimming. Mariah moved continuously, a constant presence threading through the chaos. Blood on her sleeves, sweat at her temples, eyes sharp, never unfocused. She ate nothing. She drank when reminded. She didn't stop. Staff began to mirror her pace, her focus. Fear transformed into urgency. Urgency into execution. People trusted her now, not because of rank or title, but because the results were undeniable. Lives were being saved. 15. A nurse glanced up from a chart, disbelief softening into something like awe. "Who is she?" No one answered. No one needed to. 20. The number landed with quiet weight, even as the work continued. 20 people who would breathe again. 20 families who would get phone calls that didn't end in silence. And still, Mariah did not slow. Her face remained composed, but something deeper had shifted. A current ran beneath her calm, something old and familiar, awakened by necessity. This wasn't just skill, it was memory in motion. Muscle memory shaped by pressure no training simulation could ever replicate. Those watching her felt it, even if they couldn't name it. She was operating from a place beyond textbook knowledge, beyond standard protocol, beyond what was expected. And somewhere amid the rapid saves, the impossible decisions, and the growing sense that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a truth settled over the room. They were watching a legend being built in real time. If you believe in everyday heroes like Mariah, hit that subscribe button, because this story is about to take a turn no one saw coming. The pace finally slowed, not because the danger had passed, but because the immediate wave had been beaten back. Stretchers lined the halls, occupied by people who were alive because someone refused to hesitate. The air was thick with exhaustion and relief, the kind that settles into bones. Mariah stood still for the first time in what felt like hours. She flexed her hands once, subtly, as if grounding herself. Around her, staff exchanged looks of disbelief and gratitude. Some smiled. Some cried quietly. Some simply leaned against walls, overwhelmed by what they had just survived. 2 hours. 20 lives. And Mariah Vance, the quiet nurse no one had known 3 weeks ago, stood at the center of it all, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that the hardest moment of her day was still ahead. The hospital did not return to calm so much as it drifted into something quieter, heavier. The kind of silence that follows impact. The alarms had slowed. The flood of stretchers had thinned. Staff moved more deliberately now, shoulders slumped, breaths deeper, the adrenaline finally loosening its grip. People were alive. That truth hung in the air, fragile but real. Mariah stepped into a supply room and closed the door behind her. It was the first moment she had been alone since the explosion. The room smelled of antiseptic and plastic, sharp and familiar. She turned on the sink and let the water run hot, holding her hands beneath it as blood, some hers, mostly not, spiraled down the drain in thin red ribbons. She stared at her fingers as if seeing them for the first time. They trembled, just slightly. Mariah exhaled and leaned forward, bracing herself against the counter. The noise of the emergency department was muted here, reduced to a distant hum. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe it was over, that she had done what she could, that the worst had passed. She thought of nothing at all. At the front of the hospital, 3 people stepped through the automatic doors. They moved with purpose that did not belong to families or patients. Their clothes were plain, their posture anything but. They didn't rush, didn't hesitate, didn't look lost. They scanned the lobby and practiced sweeps, cataloging exits, angles, faces. One of them approached the reception desk. "We're looking for Mariah Vance." The receptionist blinked, thrown off by the sudden shift in tone. Is she in trouble? The agent's expression didn't change. "We just need to speak with her." Word traveled quickly in hospitals, especially after days like this. Heads turned. A nurse paused mid-step. A doctor glanced up from a chart. The name carried weight now. Mariah Vance wasn't just another staff member anymore. In the supply room, Mariah shut off the water and reached for a towel. As she dried her hands, a familiar pressure settled into her chest. Not panic, not fear exactly, but recognition. The sense that something had moved closer. Something she had known would come eventually. She straightened her shoulders and stepped back into the hallway. The agents found her before she could find anyone else. They stood together, blocking the corridor just enough to make the encounter unavoidable. Conversations nearby slowed, then stopped altogether. People watched openly now, curiosity sharpening into unease. "Ms. Vance," the lead agent said, his voice calm, professional. "We need to speak with you about your service record." The words hit like a delayed aftershock. Mariah froze. It wasn't the question itself. It was the phrasing. Service record. Not employment history. Not credentials. Not licensure. This was something else. Something older. Buried deeper. Her face betrayed her before she could stop it. A flicker of recognition. Fear, quickly masked. Then resignation. Around them, confusion rippled outward. "Service record?" Someone murmured. "What does that mean?" "You were military?" Another whispered, disbelief threading through the question. Mariah said nothing at first. Her gaze dropped, just for a second, as if calculating how much truth the moment required. She had known this day might come. She had just hoped it wouldn't come here. Not now. Not after everything. She looked back up at the agent. "Yes," she said quietly. "Marine Corps." The words landed harder than she expected. The hallway felt smaller suddenly. Eyes locked onto her from every direction. The nurse who had followed her orders without question. The resident she had guided through his first real crisis. The tech who had called her name like it meant safety. They were seeing her differently now. "But that's not why you're here," Mariah continued, her voice steady despite the weight pressing down on her chest. "Is it?" The agent didn't answer right away. That silence spoke volumes. Fear crept back into the room, sharp and unwelcome. Not the fear of injury or loss, but of revelation. Of the unknown. Of the realization that the woman who had just saved 20 lives carried a past none of them understood. Mariah felt it fully now, the shift from relief to tension, from survival to consequence. The hard part, she realized, hadn't been the explosion or the blood or the impossible decisions. It was this. She had built a new life carefully, quietly, one ordinary shift at a time. And in a single sentence, it had cracked open. She met the agent's eyes, reading something there she didn't like. Not accusation. Not hostility. Certainty. Whatever they had come for, it wasn't casual. It wasn't optional. And it wasn't going away. As the agents waited, as the staff watched, as the hospital held its breath once again, one truth settled over Mariah with undeniable clarity. She had thought the hard part was over. She was wrong. The dock worker drifted upward slowly, as if surfacing from deep water. Sound returned first, muffled, distorted, unfamiliar. Then light pressed against his eyelids, too bright, too clean. His body ached in places his mind hadn't reached yet, pain registering as a dull, distant warning rather than a sharp demand. A nurse stood beside him, calm and efficient, checking vitals with practiced ease. She spoke softly, reassuring him without asking questions he couldn't yet answer. He tried to move, failed, and settled back against the pillow, breathing shallow but steady. And then he saw her. Through the narrow window in the door, framed by fluorescent light and motion beyond the glass, a woman passed by. Blood still stained the cuffs of her scrubs. Her posture was upright, alert, her head turning slightly, as if she were tracking the entire floor at once. The dockworker's breath caught. His eyes widened, pupils dilating as something ancient and buried tore free from the back of his mind. The hospital room dissolved around him, replaced by heat, dust, and the metallic taste of fear. "No," he whispered at first, barely audible. Then louder, his voice cracking with urgency. "I know her. I know that woman." The nurse turned, startled. "Sir, it's okay. You're safe." "That's her," he insisted, struggling against the weakness in his limbs. His heart rate spiked, alarms reacting instantly. She was there. She was. The world lurched. The sterile white of the hospital bled away into something harsher, grainier, alive with danger. The desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, sand whipping through the air in violent gusts. Gunfire cracked in sharp bursts, echoing off distant hills. The ground shook with each concussive thud of explosions landing too close, too often. Shouts overlapped in panic and command. Somewhere in the chaos, a woman moved with relentless focus. Mariah was younger then, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, her hands already slick with blood. Her helmet sat crooked from where she had ripped it off moments earlier to better hear over the noise. She dropped to her knees beside a fallen Marine without hesitation, pressing hard against a wound as bullets snapped overhead. "Stay with me," she said, her voice firm, unbreakable. "Do not close your eyes." The man screamed. Another explosion rocked the ground, sending sand cascading down around them. She didn't flinch. Nearby, Jake Morrison lay pinned behind a shattered vehicle, his leg mangled, pain blinding, ears ringing so hard he couldn't hear his own shouts. Smoke burned his lungs. He thought, with terrifying clarity, that this was where it ended. Then she was there. Mariah slid into cover beside him, movements sharp and precise despite the chaos. She assessed him in seconds, hands moving, voice steady even as the world fell apart around them. "You're not dying today," she told him, as if it were a fact she had already confirmed. She worked fast, faster than he thought possible. Tourniquet, pressure, reassurance woven into every instruction. She shielded him with her own body when the next blast hit, debris raining down as the air itself seemed to scream. "You saved us," Jake heard himself say later, the memory echoing as if spoken from far away. "All of us." Her eyes met his then, intense and unwavering. "I'm not done yet," she replied. The explosion came without warning. White light swallowed everything. The sound vanished. The heat vanished. The desert vanished. Back in the hospital room, Jake gasped, lungs burning as if he had just run miles. His hands clawed weakly at the sheets as the nurse called for help, her calm giving way to concern. "That's her," Jake shouted, voice hoarse but desperate. "That woman out there. She was our medic." People rushed in. The hallway beyond the door slowed as heads turned toward the sound. The name spread quickly, carried on whispers and startled looks. "Mariah?" Jake's chest rose and fell rapidly as reality crashed back into place. The memory felt impossibly close, as vivid as if it had happened moments ago instead of years. He could still smell the smoke, still feel the grit between his teeth, still hear her voice cutting through the terror like a lifeline. "She saved us," he repeated, tears streaking down the sides of his face now. "She saved me." In the hallway, staff froze mid-step. The words rippled outward, colliding with everything they thought they knew. The quiet nurse, the new hire, the woman who had taken charge without explanation and performed impossible saves with unshakable calm. A combat medic. Afghanistan. The weight of it settled heavily in the air. Mariah stood at the far end of the corridor, unaware of the exact words being spoken, but feeling the shift nonetheless. She felt eyes on her again, sharper now, filled not just with admiration, but with questions that cut deeper. Somewhere behind her, Jake's voice carried again, breaking through the hum of the hospital. "That's her," he said, louder now, certainty ringing through every syllable. "She was there. She was my medic." The staff stood frozen, caught between disbelief and dawning understanding. The woman who had just saved 20 lives in a Louisiana hospital had done it before, under fire, far from home, in a place most of them had only seen on the news. And that was only part of the story. The truth pressing its way into the open was heavier than any of them realized, because it wasn't just a story of heroism. It was one written in blood, survival, and secrets never meant to surface. The room was small, windowless, and quiet in a way that felt intentional. The noise of the hospital faded into a distant, indistinct murmur, replaced by the low hum of fluorescent lights. A table sat in the center with 3 chairs on one side and one on the other. Mariah took the lone seat without being asked. The FBI agents remained standing for a moment longer, studying her. Not with suspicion, but with the careful attention of people who already knew the outline of her story and were measuring the spaces she had yet to fill. When they finally sat, the door closed softly behind them, sealing the room from the rest of the world. For the first time since the tanker exploded, Mariah felt truly exposed. The lead agent folded his hands on the table. His voice, when he spoke, was even and deliberate. "Your unit was reported missing in action after Operation Silent Ridge," he said. "All 12 members. Presumed lost. Yet here you are." Mariah's jaw tightened. She had prepared for this moment in theory, rehearsed it in the quiet corners of her mind for years. In practice, it felt heavier than she remembered. "I can't talk about that," she said quietly. "You know I can't." The agent nodded, as if he had expected exactly that answer. "You don't have to," he replied. "We already know what happened." Mariah looked up sharply. For a fraction of a second, the room tilted. The careful balance she had maintained, between past and present, between who she had been and who she was trying to become, shifted dangerously. The agent continued, his tone calm but weighted. "We know about the ambush. We know about the extraction order. We know you were the only one who made it out." Mariah's hands curled into fists beneath the table. "But," the agent added, "what we know isn't the whole truth." The words lingered in the air, unsettling and unfinished. Memory crept in quietly, not as a rush, but as a slow, unavoidable tide. The mission had begun like countless others, controlled, deliberate, tense but familiar. Intelligence had suggested minimal resistance. A narrow window, a clear objective. They moved through hostile terrain under cover of darkness, every step calculated, every breath measured. Then everything went wrong. The first shot shattered the night like broken glass. The second followed before anyone could react. Suddenly the terrain came alive with gunfire, angles they hadn't anticipated, numbers that didn't match the briefing. The radio crackled with overlapping voices, commands, warnings, screams. They were surrounded. Mariah remembered the smell first. Burnt metal, dust, blood, the sharp sting of explosives tearing into the earth around them. She dropped instinctively, dragging a wounded Marine into cover, her hands already working even as her mind struggled to keep up. The unit fought hard. Too hard. They held longer than they should have been able to. But the enemy was relentless, closing in with terrifying precision. Orders came through the radio, fractured by interference. Retreat. Regroup. Extract if possible. It wasn't possible. One by one, the injuries mounted. Mariah moved between them, patching, compressing, reassuring, lying when she had to. She told them help was coming. She told them to hold on. She told them she wouldn't leave. Then the call came again, clearer this time, unmistakable. Immediate extraction of critical intel. One operative only. Her. She remembered the moment with brutal clarity. The weight of the device pressed into her hand. The faces around her. Some pale with pain, some already still, some staring at her with trust she didn't deserve. She argued. She begged. She screamed into the radio until her throat burned. The answer didn't change. If the intel was lost, more units would die. More missions would fail. More names would be added to lists no one wanted to read. Stay, and they all died. Leave, and she lived. Mariah made the choice she would spend the rest of her life paying for. She moved through the terrain alone, every step tearing something loose inside her chest. She reached extraction and turned back, watching from a distance as the firefight consumed what remained of her unit. She watched the flashes of gunfire, the smoke, the silence that followed. When it was over, she didn't scream. She just stood there, hollow, the weight of survival crushing her harder than any wound. The flashbacks faded, leaving her back in the small room, breath shallow, eyes damp but unblinking. The agent watched her carefully now, his voice softer when he spoke again. "For 6 years," he said, "you've been listed as the sole survivor of Silent Ridge. Officially, that's where the story ends." Mariah swallowed. "It shouldn't have been me." "But it was," the agent replied. "And you lived with that." She nodded slowly. For 6 years, Mariah Vance carried a secret she could never speak aloud. A truth wrapped in classification and guilt. She rebuilt her life quietly, deliberately, choosing professions where saving others might balance a scale she believed was forever broken. She didn't forgive herself. She didn't allow herself to. The agent leaned back slightly, studying her with something that looked less like interrogation and more like understanding. "What you did today," he said, "it matters. It always did." Mariah said nothing. Words felt inadequate. If you stand against those who abandon people in their darkest hour, wait. Because Mariah's story isn't what you think. Comment hero, if you believe sometimes survival is its own burden. The hallway felt narrower than it had minutes earlier, as if the walls themselves were closing in under the weight of everything now unsaid. Mariah stepped out of the room slowly, her expression composed but strained, the kind of control held together by sheer will. Conversations nearby hushed as she passed. Eyes followed her, not with suspicion now, but with uncertainty, with questions no one dared ask out loud. Then a voice cut through the stillness. "You left us." Mariah stopped. Jake Morrison stood a few feet away, supported by a nurse, but upright on his own, pale and unsteady, yet burning with something stronger than pain. His gaze locked onto hers, years of confusion and anger rising to the surface all at once. "We all thought you were dead," he continued, his voice trembling despite his effort to steady it. "Or worse." The words struck with the force of something long delayed. Around them, staff slowed, instinctively sensing the gravity of the moment. No one intervened. No one looked away. Mariah turned to face him fully. Tears gathered in her eyes, blurring the edges of the hallway. She had imagined this confrontation 1,000 times in quieter moments, rehearsed explanations she was never allowed to give. Now that it was here, the weight of it nearly bent her in half. "I had no choice," she said softly. "I was ordered to extract intel. When I returned," her voice broke. "You were already gone." Jake stared at her, the words landing slowly, painfully. 6 years of belief, of betrayal, of abandonment, hung suspended between them, fragile and trembling. Before either of them could speak again, the lead FBI agent stepped forward. "Actually," he said calmly, his voice carrying farther than he intended, "that's not the full story." Heads turned. A ripple of surprise moved through the onlookers. Mariah's breath caught as the agent produced a folder, worn at the edges, marked with classifications most of the people present had never seen outside of movies. "This record was sealed," the agent continued, "buried intentionally. But the truth matters now." He spoke clearly, methodically, as if laying facts on the table could reshape the past. After extraction, Mariah had not disappeared. She had argued. She had pushed. She had refused to accept the outcome she was told was inevitable. Against protocol and direct orders, she had convinced a small contingent to follow her back into hostile territory. She led them herself. The rescue mission was never meant to exist. No reports. No acknowledgments. Just risk layered on risk, driven by one person's refusal to leave others behind. When they reached the site, the devastation was nearly complete, but not total. Jake listened as the agent spoke, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, to something dangerously close to hope. "They found survivors," the agent said. 3 of them. Jake's breath hitched. 2 were beyond help, the agent continued gently. "But you weren't. Neither were 2 others." The hallway seemed to tilt. Mariah's voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. "I couldn't save everyone," she said. "But I saved who I could." Jake took an unsteady step forward. You came back for us?" he asked, the question carrying 6 years of grief, anger, and unanswered prayers. Mariah nodded, tears slipping free now. "I never stopped trying." The silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. It was tentative at first, almost uncertain, as if the sound itself needed permission to exist. Then another joined, and another. The applause grew, not loud or triumphant, but deep and resonant, filled with understanding rather than celebration. Hospital staff stood openly now, some with hands covering their mouths, others wiping tears from their eyes. They had watched Mariah save lives without asking who deserved it. Now they understood why. The narrative shifted in real time. What had once looked like abandonment revealed itself as sacrifice. What had felt like betrayal transformed into courage that came at a terrible personal cost. Jake shook his head slowly, a broken laugh escaping his lips. All this time, he said, voice thick with emotion. I thought you left us. Mariah stepped closer, closing the distance between them at last. I came back, she said, even when it meant losing everything. Because she had. The rescue had violated protocol. Command had been furious. The mission, while successful in saving lives, threatened to expose failures no one wanted examined. The solution had been simple and cruel. Quiet discharge. Classified silence. Erasure. Mariah Vance had returned home with no medals, no recognition, and no ability to tell the people she saved why she vanished from their lives. She had carried that weight alone. Until now, as the applause slowly faded, something remained in its wake. A collective understanding that heroism is rarely clean, rarely celebrated in the moment, and often misunderstood for years. Mariah stood in the center of the hallway, no longer hiding, no longer alone in her truth. For the first time in 6 years, the story she had lived with was finally being told. The room was quiet in the way only hospital rooms become after the danger has passed. Machines hummed softly, no longer urgent, no longer alarming. The light was gentle, filtered through blinds half drawn, resting on stillness rather than crisis. Mariah stood at the doorway for a moment before stepping inside. Jake Morrison lay propped up in bed, color slowly returning to his face, the harsh lines of pain softened by rest and relief. He looked older than the man she remembered from the desert, but his eyes were the same, clear now, unburdened by the weight they had carried for 6 long years. He saw her immediately. For a second, neither of them spoke. So much had already been said in hallways, in revelations, in truths unearthed too late to prevent suffering, but not too late to heal it. What remained now was quieter, harder. Jake broke the silence first. I spent 6 years thinking you abandoned us, he said, his voice low, steady but thick with emotion. I built my whole understanding of that day around that belief. He swallowed. I'm sorry. Mariah moved closer, pulling a chair to his bedside. She sat slowly, as if afraid of rushing something fragile. I spent 6 years thinking I failed you, she replied. Thinking that no matter what I did afterward, it wouldn't erase that moment. Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't look away. We both carried the wrong story. Jake nodded, the weight of it settling between them, not as a barrier, but as shared ground. For the first time since Afghanistan, there was no anger in his eyes. No accusation. Only understanding. They sat together in silence, letting forgiveness do its quiet work. It didn't arrive as a dramatic release or a sudden absolution. It came as a loosening, as breath returning to places it hadn't reached in years. Healing, it turned out, didn't need witnesses. Only truth. In the days that followed, Mariah stepped fully into her new role, not as a symbol, not as a hero, but as a leader shaped by experience rather than ego. She walked hospital corridors with purpose now, not urgency, carrying a different kind of authority, one earned not by title, but by trust. She trained staff with intensity and patience, teaching them how to think under pressure, how to act when protocols fail, how to recognize the difference between fear and danger. She spoke openly about preparation, about decisiveness, about the cost of hesitation. She never spoke about herself unless asked, and even then, only in ways that served the lesson rather than the legend. Young nurses gravitated toward her instinctively. They asked questions they were afraid to ask others. She answered without judgment. She mentored without condescension. She corrected mistakes without humiliation. Mariah implemented crisis protocols that didn't just exist on paper, but lived in muscle memory. Drills became realistic. Leadership roles rotated. Everyone learned what it felt like to make decisions when there was no time to ask permission. She couldn't change the past, the narration reflected, but she could make sure the future was different. And she did. Not loudly, not dramatically, but thoroughly. Weeks later, as the hospital settled into a new normal shaped by lessons learned the hard way, a familiar sound echoed through the halls. An emergency call came in, another situation unfolding fast, another moment demanding clarity over chaos. Mariah stood at the center of her team, the same quiet resolve in her posture, the same steady calm in her eyes. She looked at them, really looked at them, seeing not just colleagues, but people prepared to stand when it mattered. Ready? She asked. They nodded, not because they weren't afraid, but because they trusted her, and more importantly, trusted themselves. Mariah Vance's story didn't end with secrets. It ended with the truth that courage isn't about never failing. It's about showing up anyway. And when the doors opened and the work began again, she stepped forward, not running from the past, not hiding from it, but carrying it with her, transformed into purpose. The years that followed unfolded quietly at first, almost deceptively ordinary from the outside. Cypress Bay Medical Center returned to its routines, its rhythms steadier now, informed by hard-earned lessons rather than complacent assumptions. But beneath that surface calm, something fundamental had changed, and Mariah Vance was at the center of it. Her office remained modest. No plaques on the walls, no framed commendations. A whiteboard covered in evolving protocols took up most of the space, its corners crowded with handwritten notes and refinements that never seemed finished. For Mariah, preparedness was not a destination. It was a practice. She rebuilt the hospital's emergency response system from the inside out. Not as a rigid hierarchy, but as a living network. Every department learned how it fit into the whole. Every staff member, from seasoned surgeons to brand new interns, understood what leadership looked like when seconds mattered. Decision trees became instincts. Communication became reflexive. Fear was acknowledged, not suppressed, and then redirected into action. When another regional incident struck months later, smaller but still dangerous, the hospital responded with a precision that surprised even veteran observers. There was no paralysis, no waiting for orders that might never come. Teams moved as one, guided by principles Mariah had insisted on embedding deeply: clarity, accountability, adaptability. Lives were saved again. People began to notice. At first, recognition came through professional channels: quiet invitations to speak at regional healthcare forums, requests to review emergency preparedness plans at neighboring hospitals. Mariah accepted selectively. She spoke plainly, avoiding theatrics, grounding every recommendation in lived experience rather than theory. Protocols don't save lives, she told one room full of administrators. People do. Protocols just help them remember how. Word spread. State health officials requested consultations. Training programs were restructured using models she helped design. A multi-hospital coalition adopted her crisis response framework as a standard, citing its effectiveness under pressure and its emphasis on distributed leadership. Mariah never sought credit. She redirected praise toward teams, toward systems, toward the idea that preparedness was collective rather than individual. But even so, her name began to circulate beyond Louisiana. National attention followed not with fanfare, but with respect. A medical journal published a detailed case study on Cypress Bay's response to the tanker explosion, highlighting not just outcomes, but decision-making under uncertainty. Mariah was quoted sparingly, her words measured, her focus unwavering. "I don't believe in heroes," she said in the piece. "I believe in responsibility." The article traveled farther than she expected. Soon, she was asked to testify before a federal panel on emergency medical readiness. Sitting in a room far removed from hospital corridors, she spoke not as a symbol of survival or sacrifice, but as someone deeply aware of what systems look like when they fail, and how close they always are to doing so. She spoke about fatigue, about moral injury, about the danger of assuming someone else will step forward. And people listened. Funding was redirected. Training standards were revised. A national task force incorporated her recommendations into updated crisis guidelines. The changes didn't make headlines, but they saved lives in ways that never would. Jake Morrison followed her progress from a distance, proud in a way that felt grounding rather than painful. They stayed in touch, exchanging occasional messages, updates on recovery, and life moving forward. The bitterness he once carried dissolved completely, replaced by a shared understanding that survival, in all its forms, was complicated and worth honoring. Years passed. Mariah became a mentor to leaders across the country, though she never embraced the title. She continued working shifts when she could, insisting on staying connected to the front lines. Her presence steadied younger staff, not because she radiated invincibility, but because she modeled something more durable. She showed them how to keep going without hardening, how to lead without erasing empathy, how to carry memory without being crushed by it. National recognition arrived eventually, formal and unavoidable. An award ceremony, understated but significant. A citation acknowledging extraordinary contributions to emergency medicine and crisis leadership. Applause filled a room far larger than any hallway she had once stood in, unsure whether she belonged. Mariah accepted the honor with quiet grace. "This recognition doesn't belong to me alone," she said simply. "It belongs to everyone who chose action over fear when it mattered most." The audience rose to its feet anyway. What mattered more to her, though, were the messages that arrived afterward. Emails from nurses who felt seen for the first time. Letters from administrators who admitted they had underestimated the importance of preparation. Notes from survivors who would never know her personally, but whose lives had been shaped by systems she helped change. Each one reminded her why she had stayed, why she had chosen to build rather than disappear. As the years stretched on, Mariah's story became less about the past she had survived and more about the future she had shaped. She was no longer defined by Silent Ridge or classified files or the weight of impossible choices. She was defined by continuity, by showing up again and again. And somewhere, in hospitals she would never visit, in emergencies she would never witness, people lived because of decisions she once made quietly, deliberately, without expectation of recognition. That was enough. It had always been enough.